This is On the Line, and I'm Eric Felton. A court in Milan, Italy, recently blocked a new law that had charged drivers €5 to go into the center city. The law was devised to reduce traffic congestion in the city. But a private parking garage in Milan complained to the court that the reduction in traffic meant a reduction in the garage's business. The litigation points to the many challenges in finding solutions to traffic congestion. More and more countries are facing those challenges as growing numbers of middle-class consumers in Asia and Latin America buy automobiles. Is gridlock the inevitable price of prosperity? Joining us from our studio in New York City, Hope Cohen is Associate Director of the Center for Urban Innovation at the Regional Plan Association, and she deals with these issues on a regular basis. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Eric. Good to talk to you.
So how bad is traffic getting around the world?
Well, it's getting bad. Obviously, there are more people than there ever have been before, and there are also more cars, more people driving cars than there ever have been before. And various cities around the world, going back really to the 70s, have been experimenting with pricing the road more directly to the driver than we normally experience. We normally experience the cost of driving most immediately at the gas pump, and then the other costs of having a roadway system and so forth are generally out of more general tax revenue streams. But starting in the 70s, there have been various experiments in various places around the world with various technologies and to achieve different nuanced policy goals to bring the cost more immediately to the driver, the cost of contributing to traffic congestion, the cost of the air pollution, and those things have made it to these shores, to the United States. There was a famous attempt by New York City to introduce a congestion charge in 2007. San Francisco is talking about one, and those are designed. The design of both of those is, we have an acknowledgement that there's a central core of the city that's particularly congested, and should there be a particular price for entering that core. But there are different systems in different places.
How do those systems work? Where has congestion pricing for a core city, charging people to go into the core part of a city, where has that been done so far?
There are three major international examples. The longest standing, most sophisticated one is actually in Singapore, and probably the most famous one, especially for us in the United States, is in London, and there's also an important one in Stockholm. There have been a couple of smaller places in Norway. Obviously, the Milan situation. Milan had an experiment a few years ago. It ended, and they were now planning to have a broader pilot this year, and have run into this legal problem.
And are the situations in London where you're trying to deal with a sort of congestion in a real core of the city, is that kind of solution relevant for sort of big sprawling cities like Beijing or New Delhi, where there seem to be traffic jams that stretch for dozens and dozens of miles in every direction?
Well, Beijing actually has announced that it's going to do something like this, but it hasn't started yet. And honestly, Hong Kong talked about it some years ago, but dropped it in the face of public opposition. As I mentioned, there are various different types of schemes and various different types of technologies. Generally, these days, when people talk about urban congestion pricing, they're talking about some kind of charge to enter a core city. However, there are other kinds of charges that would deal better with long stretches of highway, as you mentioned. You may even have heard in the United States of so-called Lexus lanes near, for example, San Diego. I think there are some in Texas as well. And those are lanes of highways that are reserved either for high occupancy vehicles, for more than one person in the car, carpooling, if you will, or if you're driving alone, that you can have a charge taken out, an automatic toll, essentially, for the privilege of driving in that less congested lane.
Well, now that's one of the things that raises a sort of an issue that has been part of the debate, which is, as you termed it, a Lexus lane, a luxury car lane. And you go to London, and in the center city, there seems to be a very high proportion of BMWs and Mercedes and Lexus and Rolls-Royce, and perhaps more than just would be there for the banking business in London. But it does raise the question of whether these pricing systems make it easier for the wealthy to travel than for those who can't afford the tolls.
Well, that is certainly one of the arguments that comes up in these debates, and other than in Singapore, which really, does not have that kind of public discourse. The other places where a charge has been implemented or attempted to be implemented, there has always been a very robust debate. Often there's been a public referendum. Stockholm famously had a 7-month trial period followed by a public referendum. And the public referendum in the city of Stockholm approved continuation of the charge. In the suburbs, where the referendum was essentially informational and didn't have the force of law, it actually went down to defeat. But the government of Sweden decided to implement it after all, based on the local vote in Stockholm itself. So there's always a robust debate. There's always a significant disagreement about between people in the core that's going to be protected by the charge, and people immediately out of the core. In New York City, that was a very robust debate about Manhattan versus the so-called outer boroughs, the other 4 boroughs of New York City. That's a long-standing and emotional issue for people in New York about the relationship between Manhattan and those other sections of the city. And honestly now, some years later, a major traffic expert in New York has started to propose a new pricing system that's not a congestion pricing system. That's actually a fine-tuning of our existing bridge and tunnel tolls, which are irrational based on kind of historical precedent. But his point is, if we rationalize them, it would actually achieve many of the same goals, but in a fairer way that people in the boroughs outside of Manhattan would not object to, because they would get some benefits as well.
Are there ways of trying to influence people's behavior of where they drive and when they drive, that instead of being built around sort of disincentives, higher costs imposed on people traveling at rush hour or to particular center areas of the city, that provide incentives to them instead? There have been some academics looking at ways of presenting almost lottery-like prizes to people who travel on off-peak hours as a way of doing it, rather than sort of carrots rather than sticks, if you would.
Well, there's kind of 2 pieces of that. As you note, most of these systems have different charges at different times of the day to reflect when there really is congestion. So in a sense, yes, you do get rewarded if you travel outside of the congestion period. So you are given that incentive to travel at 6 o'clock rather than 5 o'clock p.m., for example, and you can win that lottery that way. The other thing that was an absolutely essential component in London was to improve public transport in advance of imposing the charge. So in London, there was a massive increase in bus service, and improvement in bus service. Not only did London buy many hundreds of buses, ultimately thousands of buses to add to the bus fleet, and new modern ones that all kinds of people who before that would not consider riding a bus started to ride, but they also built very highly enforced bus lanes so that the buses could really move through traffic. So people who chose to abandon their car and instead take the bus not only paid a smaller bus fare than they would a congestion charge in a private automobile, but also had vastly improved frequency and speed of service over what had been the case before.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Hope Cohen of the Center for Urban Innovation at the Regional Plan Association. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Before we go, I'd like to invite you to send us your questions or comments. You can reach us through our website at voanews.com/ontheline. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you'll join us again next week for On the Line.